The morning of October 16th was unusually dank and foggy. A gray haze enveloped Amsterdam, as if trying to hide a terrible discovery that would soon leave the city in a state of shock and bewilderment. Two fishermen, Peter and Johan, were out for their usual morning fishing in one of the city's many canals. The dim light was barely breaking through the thick fog when Peter noticed something unusual floating just off the shore. As they came closer, the men were horrified to realize that the body of a young man was in front of them. Police arrived on the scene 20 minutes after the fisherman's call. Detective Anna van der Berg, a 45-year-old woman with a penetrating gaze and a steely tone in her voice, was the first to approach the body. She immediately realized it was not an accident or suicide. The signs of violent death were obvious even on a cursory examination. It took the experts several hours to thoroughly examine the crime scene and collect all possible evidence. The body was removed from the water and sent to the morgue for an autopsy. Van der Berg personally oversaw the process, never missing a single detail. By noon, the identity of the deceased was established. He was Lucas van der Meer, an 18-year-old freshman at the University of Amsterdam. A talented, promising young man whose life had ended so tragically and mysteriously at its very beginning. Van der Berg immediately sent her people to interview Lucas's neighbors and acquaintances. She herself decided to start with a visit to the university. Professor Hendrik Joosten, the freshman curator, greeted the detective with obvious concern. He fidgeted nervously with a button on his sleeve as he talked about Lucas. He was one of the brightest students in the course. Despite his young age, he was already involved in an important research project. "I'm sorry, but I can't reveal the details. It's confidential." Van der Berg noted to herself the professor's strange behavior. Something told her that Joosten knew more than he was saying. But for now, the detective decided not to press, only gently asking, "Have you noticed any changes in Lucas's behavior lately?" The professor thought for a moment, then replied, "Now that you ask, yes, he has seemed a bit distracted in recent weeks. Even missed a couple important lectures. That wasn't like him." Leaving Joosten's office, Van der Berg felt she had hit the trail. But where would it lead? The detective realized that this was only the beginning of a complex investigation. The next item on Van der Berg's list was the student dormitory where Lucas lived. She hoped to find some clues there. In Lucas's room, she was met by a crying girl, Sophie Bergman, a friend of the deceased. Her eyes were red from crying, but Van der Berg noticed something else in them. Fear? Guilt? She couldn't quite pinpoint it. "Miss Bergman, I'm very sorry for your loss," the detective began. "Could you tell me the last time you saw Lucas?" Sophie seemed to gather her thoughts before answering. "3 days ago, we had a bit of a fight. I went to visit a friend and only got back this morning." Van der Berg listened intently, noting every detail in her story. Something in the girl's words didn't add up. She asked softly, "And what was your argument about, if it's not a secret?" Sophie hesitated for a moment. It was stupid. I was jealous of his studies. He was spending too much time on his project, barely paying attention to me." The detective nodded, but felt the girl was understating something. She decided to come at it from a different angle. "Did Lucas ever mention any problems? Maybe someone threatened him?" Sophie shook her head. "No, nothing like that. He was happy. At least it seemed that way to me." As she left the dormitory, Van der Berg was sure of one thing. This story was much more complicated than it seemed at first glance. She felt that both Sophie and Professor Joosten were hiding something. But what? Back at the station, the detective found that her team had already collected the first results of the interviews. The dorm neighbors had indeed heard a loud argument in Lucas's room the day before he disappeared. This contradicted what Sophie had said. In addition, one of the students claimed to have seen Lucas getting into an expensive black car with tinted windows late at night. Van der Berg rubbed her chin thoughtfully. The picture was getting more and more confusing. Who was driving that car? And why had Sophie lied about the time of their last meeting? How had an 18-year-old student gotten involved in something so serious that it had led to his death? Suddenly, there was a knock at the detective's office. It was a young officer holding an envelope. "This just arrived in your name, detective. An anonymous letter." Detective Anna van der Berg scrutinized the contents of the anonymous letter. Inside was a sheet with a brief message. Check Lucas's financial transactions for the last month. Van der Berg frowned, realizing that this could be an important lead. Determined to proceed methodically, the detective compiled a list of prime suspects. Sophie Bergman was at the top of the list. Her contradictory statements and strange behavior were suspicious. Next on the list was Professor Hendrik Joosten, Lucas's supervisor. Van der Berg also added the unknown driver of the black car and decided to check the victim's immediate surroundings, friends and neighbors in the dormitory. The detective decided to start by talking to Sophie again. This time she invited the girl to the station, hoping that the official atmosphere would help to achieve more frankness. Sophie looked tense, nervously tugging at the sleeve of her sweater. Van der Berg started from afar, asking about how Sophie had met Lucas. Gradually, the girl relaxed a bit, talking about their first meeting at the introductory lecture and how quickly they bonded. Lucas was very ambitious, Sophie said quietly, looking somewhere in the distance. He always said he wanted to succeed, to become someone important. Sometimes I thought I didn't understand him. Van der Berg caught more than admiration in those words. Did you ever feel jealousy or resentment because of his ambition? She asked cautiously. Sophie flinched as if from a blow. I loved him, she squeezed out through her tears. But lately he's been so distant, always disappearing somewhere, never answering his cell phone. The detective felt she was getting close to something important. Tell me more about what Lucas has been up to lately. What do you know about it? The girl hesitated, but then, as if making up her mind, spoke quickly and confusedly. I don't know exactly what he's been up to. Lucas said he had an opportunity to make a lot of money, but he was afraid something might go wrong. Van der Berg listened intently, noting every detail. Did he say who offered him the opportunity? Sophie shook her head. No, but there was an incident, about a week ago. I went into his room and he was on the phone, yelling at someone, demanding they leave him alone. When he saw me, he hung up on me. I've never seen him so scared. This new information got the detective thinking. What could Lucas have been involved in? And what did it have to do with his death? Thanking Sophie, Van der Berg let her go, but asked her to stay in town. Next on the list was Professor Joosten. Joosten met the detective in his office, littered with books and papers. He looked tired and depressed. What can I do for you, detective? He asked, pointing to the chair across from his desk. Van der Berg decided to get straight to the point. Professor, I need to know everything about Lucas's behavior lately. Have you noticed anything unusual? Joosten hesitated. Lucas was a very capable student, but in the last month he started skipping classes. His grades dropped. I tried to talk to him, but he kept avoiding me. Do you have any idea what might have caused this change? Van der Berg asked. The professor nervously adjusted his glasses. I'm not sure if I should talk about it, but I once saw Lucas talking to some man outside the university. They were arguing about something and Lucas looked very agitated. Van der Berg tensed. Can you describe this man? Tall, well-dressed, about 40 years old maybe. He had a very distinctive feature, a scar on his left cheek, Joosten replied. Leaving the professor's office, Van der Berg felt that the case was becoming more and more confusing. Who is the man with the scar? And what role does he play in this story? The next step was to investigate Lucas's entourage. The detective went to the dormitory to talk to neighbors and friends of the deceased. Mark, Lucas's roommate, turned out to be a nervous young man with disheveled hair and a frightened look. He reluctantly let Van der Berg in, constantly looking around. Lucas hasn't been himself lately, Mark muttered, avoiding looking the detective in the eye. Always going out, always coming back late, and a couple times I saw him counting large sums of money. Do you have any idea where he might have gotten that money from? Van der Berg asked. Mark hesitated, but then nodded. I heard him talking on the phone, something about delivering packages. I thought, maybe he was in touch with drug dealers. This new information piqued the detective's interest. Maybe Lucas really was involved in illegal activity that ended up costing him his life. Returning to the station, Van der Berg mentally summarized her findings. She had several theories: Lucas's possible connection to the drug trade, the mysterious man with the scar, and the student's sudden possession of large sums of money. Sitting down at her desk, the detective began drafting requests to check Lucas's financial transactions and search for information about the man with the scar. She felt she was on the right track, but realized that the investigation could be far more dangerous than it initially seemed. The results were unexpected. Several large sums of money from anonymous sources had been deposited into the young man's account over the past month. This confirmed what his roommate had said about Lucas's sudden wealth. Deciding to dig deeper, Vanderberg sent an inquiry to Lucas's hometown, a small town in the south of the Netherlands. She hoped that information about the victim's past would help shed light on the present. While she waited for a response, the detective decided to talk to other students in Lucas's entourage. First in line was Tim Van Houten, a close friend of the victim. Tim appeared to be a tall guy with an open face and sad eyes. He was nervous, constantly rubbing the bracelet on his wrist. "Lucas has always been ambitious," Tim began, looking somewhere past the detective. "But lately he's changed, became secretive, nervous." Vanderberg gently prodded him to continue. "Did you notice when exactly these changes began?" Tim thought for a moment. "About a month ago. Lucas came home from the house after the weekend somehow different, said he met an old friend who offered him a job." That information piqued the detective's interest. "He didn't mention this friend's name?" Tim shook his head. "No, but he said it was someone from his past, someone he knew before he moved to Amsterdam." Vanderberg made a mental note to check Lucas's connections in his hometown. She thanked Tim and let him go, feeling she had gotten an important lead. Returning to her desk, the detective found that a response to her inquiry from Lucas's hometown had arrived. She eagerly began to study the documents. It turned out that Lucas's family was not wealthy. His father worked as a mechanic, his mother as a nurse. Lucas himself studied well, but did not stand out. However, one detail attracted the attention of Vanderberg. A year before entering the university, Lucas was detained by the police for a minor offense. He was in the company of local hooligans when they were caught stealing from the store. The case didn't progress. Lucas was released with a warning. But this information got the detective thinking. Perhaps someone from that company was the old friend who offered Lucas the job. Vanderberg decided to check this version. She contacted the local police and asked for information about the other participants in the incident. While she was waiting for a reply, there was a knock on her office. It was Sophie, Lucas's girlfriend. She looked worried and was holding a small box. "Detective, I found this in Lucas's things," Sophie said in a trembling voice. "I think you should see this." Vanderberg carefully opened the box. Inside was an old cell phone and a few pictures. One of them showed Lucas standing in an embrace with a man in his 30s. The man had a scar on his left cheek. "Do you know who that is?" the detective asked, showing the picture to Sophie. The girl shook her head. "I've never seen him before. But Lucas once mentioned someone named Eric, said it was an old acquaintance of his from home." Vanderberg thanked Sophie for the information, and as soon as the girl left, immediately sent a request for the identification of the man with the scar. An hour later came the reply from the police in Lucas's hometown. Among the participants in that long-ago incident was one Eric Van Dam, who had already been in trouble with the law at that time. After that, he had come to the attention of the police several times on suspicion of drug trafficking, but nothing could be proved. Vanderberg felt she was on the trail. She decided to see if this Eric was connected to the man in the photograph. Meanwhile, the technical department finished analyzing Lucas's old phone. Most of the messages had been deleted, but a few had been recovered. One in particular caught the detective's attention. "L. Meet me Thursday at the usual place. Don't forget the package. E." The date of the message matched the day Lucas disappeared. Vanderberg began to put the pieces of the puzzle together. It looked like Lucas had indeed gotten caught up in some illegal activity, but something had gone wrong. Maybe he decided to get out of the game, or learned something he wasn't supposed to know. The detective decided to check the security cameras in the neighborhood where Lucas was last seen. After several hours of watching, she spotted a familiar figure. Lucas was entering a small cafe on a street corner. 20 minutes later, he emerged from there in the company of a man Van der Berg recognized immediately by the scar on his cheek. They got into a black car and drove away. This was the last tape in which Lucas was seen alive. Van der Berg immediately sent a team to check the cafe. Maybe one of the staff would remember something useful. While the check was underway, the detective continued to look into Lucas's background. She contacted his parents, hoping to get more information. The conversation with Lucas's parents was emotional. They were shocked by what had happened and couldn't believe their son could have been involved in something illegal. "Lucas has always been a good boy," the mother said through tears. "He was so excited when he went to university, said it was his chance for a better life." Lucas's father added, "Last time he came home, he seemed stressed, said he had an opportunity to make a lot of money. We tried to question him, but he kept quiet." Van der Berg asked cautiously, "Do you know if Lucas might have been in touch with any of his old acquaintances? Perhaps with a man named Eric?" The parents looked at each other. Lucas's father frowned. "Eric Van Dam? They were friends in high school, but then they split up. Eric got involved with bad company. We forbade Lucas from associating with him." This information confirmed the detective's suspicions. It seems that Eric Van Dam was a key figure in this story. Back at the station, Van der Berg found that the results of the cafe inspection had come in. The waitress remembered Lucas and his companion. She said the young man looked tense, and the man with the scar spoke quietly but insistently. "I overheard part of their conversation by accident," the waitress said. "Something about the latest deal and the big money. The young man was saying he wanted out, and the man with the scar convinced him to continue." Van der Berg felt she was getting closer to a clue. She gathered all the information available and began to put together the big picture. It seemed that Eric Van Dam, an old acquaintance of Lucas's, had gotten him involved in some illegal activity, possibly drug-related. Lucas, in need of money, agreed, but at some point he decided to pull out. It was probably that decision that cost him his life. Now the main task was to find Eric Van Dam. Van der Berg ordered a manhunt for him and stepped up surveillance of all known drug distribution points in the city. She realized that she was getting closer to a clue, but she also realized that the case was becoming increasingly dangerous. Van der Berg decided to proceed cautiously, realizing that the people she was dealing with would stop at nothing to keep their secrets. Detective Anna Van der Berg's investigation took an unexpected turn when a report of strange phone calls from Lucas van der Meer appeared on her desk. All the calls were addressed to one Elizabeth Klein, the 42-year-old owner of an art gallery, an intriguing detail that could shed light on the last days of a young student's life. The dossier on Elizabeth Klein revealed nothing criminal. A successful businesswoman, divorced, no children. However, the connection with the 18-year-old student required an explanation. Van der Berg decided to personally meet with Elizabeth in her gallery, located in an upscale neighborhood of Amsterdam. Elizabeth Klein turned out to be an attractive woman with short blonde hair and a penetrating gaze. Despite her outward confidence, the detective noticed a slight tension in her posture at the mention of Lucas's name. Starting the conversation from afar, Van der Berg gradually led Elizabeth to the main question about the nature of her relationship with Lucas. After some hesitation, Elizabeth admitted that their relationship went beyond just employer and employee. Elizabeth's account revealed new facets of Lucas's personality. She described him as a mature beyond his years, an ambitious young man with whom she could discuss art and life for hours. Their relationship began when Lucas came to work at the gallery and gradually grew into something more. A key moment in Elizabeth's story was their last meeting, the day before Lucas disappeared. She described how he came to her house late one night, looking worried and scared. Lucas mentioned some trouble with an old friend and debts, and spoke of the need to leave town immediately. Van der Berg listened intently, noting every detail. She asked if Elizabeth had noticed anything unusual in Lucas's behavior in the last weeks before his disappearance. Elizabeth hesitated, thinking back. She said that Lucas had become more withdrawn, often canceling their meetings at the last minute. One day she noticed a bruise on his arm, which he tried to hide. When she asked about it, Lucas brushed it off, saying he'd just had a bad fall. The detective asked if Lucas had mentioned anyone named Eric or talked about his past. Elizabeth shook her head, but then remembered the strange phone conversation she'd overheard by accident. Lucas had been talking to someone he called A, and the conversation had sounded strained. Vanderberg decided to dig deeper and asked Elizabeth about Lucas's financial situation. The woman admitted that she sometimes helped him with money, knowing his tight circumstances. However, in the last month, Lucas had unexpectedly repaid her debts and even bought her an expensive gift, which was completely out of line with his usual financial situation. This information got the detective thinking. She thanked Elizabeth for her candor and asked her to let her know if she remembered anything else. Leaving the gallery, Vanderberg felt she had gotten important pieces of the puzzle. Lucas's relationship with Elizabeth added another layer of complexity to the case. Could that connection have had any bearing on his death? Or was it just a sideline in a darker story? The detective decided to check Elizabeth's financial transactions and look for possible connections between her and others involved in the case. She also put in a request to check the surveillance cameras in the area of Elizabeth's home from the night of her last encounter with Lucas. Back at the station, Vanderberg began to draw up a new pattern of connections. There were now 3 key figures at the center of this scheme: Lucas, Eric, and Elizabeth. She felt that the clue was somewhere near, but she could not yet grasp all the connections. Suddenly there was a knock on the detective's office. It was her colleague with new information. They'd found a witness who'd seen Lucas the night he disappeared, and this witness mentioned that Lucas wasn't alone. A woman matching Elizabeth Klein's description was with him. Detective Anna Vanderberg sat at her desk, immersed in examining Lucas Vandermeer's financial records. After a week of waiting, the bank had finally provided the young man's account statements. What she saw made her frown. Over the past 3 months, large sums of money had been regularly deposited into Lucas's account. The source was an anonymous account, which in itself was suspicious. Vanderberg noted that the receipts occurred every week, usually on Wednesdays or Thursdays. The detective decided to match the dates of the receipts to Lucas's schedule. She contacted the university and requested the students' attendance information. It turned out that on the days the money came into the account, Lucas often missed evening classes or left early. This information interested Vanderberg. She remembered Elizabeth Klein's art gallery and decided to check if the days when the money came in coincided with Lucas's work schedule at the gallery. The detective went to the gallery disguised as a potential buyer. Talking to one of the employees, she inquired about the work schedule. It turned out that the gallery worked until late in the evening only on Fridays and Saturdays. On other days, it closed at 6 in the evening. This did not coincide with Lucas's schedule of cash receipts and class absences. Vanderberg felt that something didn't add up here. She decided to have another conversation with Sophie, Lucas's girlfriend. This time, the conversation took place in an informal setting, in a park near the university. Sophie looked tired and depressed. Vanderberg cautiously began to ask her about the last weeks of Lucas's life. The girl reluctantly admitted that their relationship had been strained during that period. He had become somewhat secretive, Sophie said, looking off into the distance. Often canceled our meetings at the last minute, said he was busy working at the gallery. But when I went there one day to surprise him, he wasn't there. This information interested the detective. She asked if Sophie had noticed any change in Lucas's financial situation. The girl hesitated for a moment. Now that you ask, yes, there was something strange. About a month before what happened, he started taking me to expensive restaurants, bought me a new cell phone. I wondered where he got the money from. He said it was a bonus for good work at the gallery. Vanderberg noted this discrepancy. She asked Sophie to remember if Lucas had talked about new acquaintances or mentioned anyone out of the ordinary. Sophie shook her head, but then suddenly remembered. You know, there was this one weird thing. I saw a message from some A on his phone. It was kind of intimate. When I asked Lucas about it, he got angry and said it was just a joke from a friend. The detective thanked Sophie for the information and returned to the station. She began to analyze the data she had gathered. Regular cash receipts, skipping classes, lying about working at the gallery, and strange messages all indicated that Lucas had some sort of secret life. Vanderberg decided to check surveillance tapes in the neighborhood where Elizabeth Klein lived. She requested records for the past 3 months. focusing on days when there were cash deposits into Lucas's account. Reviewing the records took several days. It was tedious work, but on the third day, the detective noticed something interesting. On several of the tapes, she saw Lucas entering the apartment complex where Elizabeth lived. This was happening on the exact days that money was deposited into his account. Vanderberg felt she was getting closer to a clue, but she couldn't yet tie all the strings together. She decided to meet with Elizabeth Klein again, now that she had the new information in hand. The meeting was scheduled at the police station. Elizabeth looked tense, but she was confident. Vanderberg started the conversation from afar, asking about Lucas's work at the gallery. Elizabeth answered calmly, confirming that Lucas was a diligent worker. But when the detective asked about specific dates and times he worked, the woman began to get confused. Vanderberg decided to press, "Mrs. Klein, we have surveillance footage that shows Lucas entering your apartment complex in the evening when the gallery is closed. How do you explain that?" Elizabeth turned visibly pale. She started to talk about the extra tasks Lucas was supposedly doing, but her explanations sounded unconvincing. The detective felt she was close to a breakthrough, but realized she didn't have enough evidence to press charges yet. She decided to dig further, feeling that the mystery of Lucas and Elizabeth's relationship could be the key to solving the entire case. As she left the interrogation room, Vanderberg was certain of one thing. There was a relationship between Elizabeth and Lucas that went beyond mere work, and that relationship somehow involved regular money transfers. But what was the true nature of that relationship? And what did they have to do with Lucas's death? These questions still remained unanswered. Detective Anna Vanderberg sat at her desk, immersed in thought. The past weeks of investigation had led her to believe that there had been some sort of secret relationship between Lucas Vandermeer and Elizabeth Klein, involving regular money transfers. But what the nature of this relationship was, and how it related to Lucas's death, remained a mystery. Suddenly, there was a knock at the office. It was a young officer from the technical department. "Detective, we were finally able to decrypt the deleted messages from Lucas's phone," he said, holding out a folder of printouts. Vanderberg eagerly grabbed the documents and began reading. Most of the messages were short and cryptic, but one caught her particular attention. "Tomorrow at 8. The usual place. Don't be late. E." The date of the message matched the day Lucas disappeared. The detective decided to double-check the surveillance footage from that evening. She requested access to cameras in a wider radius around Elizabeth's house. After several hours of viewing, Vanderberg spotted the familiar figure of Lucas entering an alleyway not far from Elizabeth's house. A few minutes later, a woman who looked like Elizabeth entered the same alley. They both walked out of there about an hour later. This was the first direct evidence of their secret meetings. Vanderberg felt she was getting closer to a clue. She decided to question Elizabeth again, now with new evidence in hand. However, when the detective arrived at Elizabeth's house, the neighbor said she had not seen her for several days. Vanderberg immediately dispatched a patrol car to Elizabeth's gallery. The officers reported that the gallery was closed, and the staff claimed that Elizabeth had taken a sudden leave of absence for family reasons. The detective sensed an opportunity to solve the case slipping away. She urgently requested a warrant to review camera footage at the airport and train stations. After several hours of tense waiting, the answer came. Elizabeth Klein had been seen on the cameras at Schiphol Airport last night. She had boarded a flight to Barcelona. Vanderberg immediately contacted the Spanish police, giving them all available information about Elizabeth. An international operation was launched to find her. Meanwhile, the detective continued to unravel the threads of the case in Amsterdam. She decided to have another talk with Tim Van Houten, a close friend of Lucas. Tim looked nervous and avoided looking the detective in the eye. Vanderberg sensed he was hiding something. "Tim, I know you didn't tell us everything last time," she began softly. "Lucas was your friend. If you know something that can help us find his killer, you need to tell me." Tim hesitated for a few seconds and then broke into sobs. Through his tears, he revealed that Lucas had shared his secret with him shortly before his death. "He said he got into some kind of trouble with a rich woman," Tim sobbed. "Said she was paying him for meetings, but then he wanted to stop it, and she started threatening him." That information was a clue. Vanderberg began to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Lucas, a student in need of money, had agreed to secret meetings with Elizabeth for a fee. But when he decided to end that relationship, something went wrong. The detective went back to Elizabeth's financial records. She discovered that on the day Lucas disappeared, a large sum of cash had been withdrawn from Elizabeth's account. A theory began to take shape. Perhaps Lucas was blackmailing Elizabeth by threatening to reveal their relationship. The meeting that evening could have been an attempt to resolve the conflict, but something had gone wrong. Vanderberg urgently contacted the Spanish police, providing them with new information and a theory. A few hours later, a message arrived. Elizabeth Klein had been detained in a small coastal town near Barcelona. The detective immediately flew to Spain for questioning. When she entered the room where Elizabeth was being held, she saw a broken woman in front of her, not the confident businesswoman she had known before. Elizabeth began to speak before Vanderberg could ask the first question. She confessed her relationship with Lucas, talked about the blackmail and the fateful encounter that night. "I didn't mean to kill him," Elizabeth sobbed. "We had a fight. He threatened to tell me everything. I pushed him. He hit his head on the edge of the table. I panicked." Vanderberg listened to the confession, feeling a mixture of satisfaction at having solved the case and bitterness at the tragic nature of the situation. A young man looking for easy money and a lonely woman willing to pay for company and attention. Their secret affair, which began as a mutually beneficial transaction, ended in tragedy for both. The detective knew there was a lot of work ahead. She had to file all the paperwork for Elizabeth's extradition, gather all the evidence for the trial, break the news to Lucas and Sophie's parents. But the main thing was done. The murder had been solved and the culprit had been found. Vanderberg felt tired, but also satisfied with the accomplished duty. She realized that this case would remain in her memory for a long time, as a reminder of how dangerous secrets can be and to what tragic consequences seemingly innocuous decisions can lead. 2 weeks had passed since Elizabeth Klein's confession in Spain, and now all the details were finally coming together. Elizabeth's extradition to the Netherlands was followed by long hours of interrogation. Gradually, a complete picture of the events of that fateful night and the days that followed emerged. Elizabeth admitted that their relationship with Lucas began by chance. The young man worked part-time at her gallery, and one evening they got to talking. Lucas complained about financial difficulties, and Elizabeth, feeling lonely after the divorce, offered him extra income for making company. Their secret meetings continued for several months. Lucas received money, and Elizabeth, the attention of a young, attractive man. But gradually, the situation began to get out of control. Lucas began to demand more and more money, threatening to expose their relationship. Elizabeth, fearing for her reputation, agreed. But that night, she decided to put an end to it. They met at her apartment. The conversation quickly turned into an argument. Lucas shouted that he would tell everyone about their liaison unless she paid him a large sum of money. Elizabeth, in a fit of rage, pushed him. Lucas fell, hitting his head on the edge of the glass coffee table. "I panicked," Elizabeth sobbed during the interview. "He was lying there, not moving, and there was a pool of blood spreading around his head. I didn't know what to do." In a state of shock, Elizabeth decided to dispose of the body. She wrapped Lucas in a rug and struggled to drag him to her car, parked in an underground garage. Deep in the night, she drove the body to the canal and pushed it into the water. Vanderberg sighed, remembering how they had found that rug hidden in a dumpster near Elizabeth's house. DNA testing had confirmed that Lucas's blood was on it. The detective turned the page of the report. There were the results of the final forensic analysis. Lucas's cause of death was indeed a head injury consistent with hitting a glass table. But there was another important fact. Water was found in Lucas's lungs. This meant that Lucas was still alive when Elizabeth pushed him into the canal. He had died not from the impact, but from drowning. Vanderberg felt a heaviness in her chest. If Elizabeth had called an ambulance immediately after Lucas fell, he might have been saved. Panic and fear for her reputation had caused the accident to turn into a murder. The detective closed the folder and leaned back in her chair. The case was solved, but there was no sense of satisfaction, only bitterness at the senselessness of this tragedy. She remembered the conversation she'd had with Lucas's parents when she'd informed them the case had been solved. Their faces, full of pain and incomprehension, would forever be etched in her memory. How to explain to them that their son had died because of a secret relationship with a woman twice his age? Sophie, Lucas's girlfriend, was also devastated by the news. "I felt something was wrong," she said through tears, "but I could never think. Why didn't he come to me? Why didn't he tell me?" Vanderberg realized that this case would change the lives of many people. Elizabeth was facing a trial and probably a long prison sentence. Her gallery had already closed, and her reputation in the art world was ruined. The detective stood up and walked to the window. It was raining outside, the drops dripping down the glass, reminding her of the night Lucas's body had been found in the canal. She remembered how it had started, the unidentified body of a young man found by fishermen in the early morning. At the time, it had seemed like just another complicated case. Now, she realized that this investigation would forever change the way she looked at her job. The detective put the documents in her briefcase and turned off the lights in her office. As she left the police department building, she thought about the fact that tomorrow would start a new day and new investigations. But the Lucas van der Meer case would stay with her forever, as a reminder of how unpredictable and fragile human life could be. Walking through the rain-soaked streets of Amsterdam, Vanderberg thought about Lucas and Elizabeth, about the young man whose ambition and financial difficulties had pushed him down a dangerous path, a woman whose loneliness and fear of old age had led to a tragic mistake.